My daughter and her husband threw me out of my own business the morning after Thanksgiving. My son-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "You're a liability now, old man. Time to step aside." I nodded, walked to my truck, and made 2 phone calls. 18 days later, they were driving to every address they had for me, leaving 94 missed calls, begging me to come back. They thought they'd finally gotten rid of the old man who'd built everything they owned. They had no idea what they'd actually done. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one. The drive back from my brother Gerald's place in Knoxville takes about 4 hours through the kind of Tennessee hills that make you remember why you stayed in this part of the country. I'd left early Friday morning, grateful for the excuse to skip the awkward silences that Thanksgiving dinner had become over the past few years. Gerald's wife made good pie, the grandkids were loud and happy, and for 2 days I'd almost forgotten that something at home felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. I noticed it first when I turned onto the service road behind the strip mall. The parking lot lights were still on, which was normal for a Friday after Thanksgiving. My daughter and her husband usually opened early for the holiday weekend crowd. What wasn't normal was the padlock on the back entrance. I'd been using that door for 11 years. My key went in, turned halfway, and stopped. Same feeling as inserting the wrong key entirely. Solid resistance, like the lock didn't recognize me anymore. I stood there in the cool November air, staring at a door I'd built the frame for myself back in 2013. When the previous frame had rotted through, I'd mixed the concrete, set the posts, hung the door. My hands had touched every surface of this building at one point or another, and now it wouldn't let me in. I tried the front entrance. Different lock, same result. My key, my building. My name still on the original deed of sale from when I'd purchased the property outright in 2009. And I was standing on the sidewalk like a stranger. The sign above the window still read Crawford's Hardware and Supply. My name, my father's name. The store I'd opened 6 years after my wife Linda passed, because I needed something to pour myself into, and because this town needed a proper hardware store after the big box chains had killed every local option within 30 miles. I pulled out my phone. My daughter's number rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her voice was cheerful and recorded, asking me to leave a message. I tried my son-in-law next, straight to voicemail without a single ring, which meant he'd seen my name and declined the call deliberately. Standing there on the Main Street sidewalk of Harlan Creek, Tennessee, with my own store locked in front of me, I did what I'd learned to do in 67 years of living. I didn't panic. I thought the cafe 2 doors down was open. Margaret Tilson had been running it since before I'd opened my store, and she made the best coffee in the county without any argument. I settled into a corner booth and ordered a cup, trying to arrange the facts in some order that made sense. My daughter had married my son-in-law 8 years ago. He'd seemed fine at first. Charming, actually, with the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you know someone well enough to see the gap between the two. He'd been in sales, between jobs when they met, and within a year of the wedding, he'd started coming into the store with suggestions, inventory ideas, marketing strategies, ways to modernize. I'd been cautious but open. The store was doing well, but I wasn't so proud that I'd refuse good ideas just because they came from outside the family. And he was family now, or trying to be. So I brought him on, started him at the counter, moved him to purchasing after 2 years when he showed he had a head for it, made him operations manager in year 4. My daughter had grown up in the store. She'd worked the register as a teenager, gone to UT Knoxville for business, come back and helped me modernize the accounting systems. She was sharp, and I was proud of her. And when she married him, I thought I was getting a capable son-in-law who'd help keep the family business running into the next generation. What I hadn't accounted for was what happens when 2 capable people start thinking of something as theirs when the paperwork still says someone else entirely. The shift had been gradual, the way temperature drops in the fall. 1 degree at a time until you realize you're cold. They'd started making decisions without consulting me around year 5. Small things initially, a vendor change, a new display layout, then larger ones. A lease on a commercial van I didn't know about until I saw the payment hit the business account. A staffing decision that let go of a man who'd worked for me for 6 years, made while I was visiting Gerald in Knoxville. I'd push back each time. And each time there'd been a conversation that ended with my daughter saying things like, "Dad, you need to trust us." Or my son-in-law using words like legacy and transition in ways that made me feel like I was already being talked about in past tense. By last summer, I'd started to feel like a consultant in my own store. Staff came to me less often with questions. Suppliers had my son-in-law's number in their phones as the primary contact. My office had been quietly relocated from the front corner to a back room near the stockroom, explained as a space optimization decision. But my name was still on everything that mattered: the deed, the business license, the commercial insurance policy, the bank account that had been in my name since before either of them had ever set foot in the building. I'd noticed all of it. I just hadn't wanted to believe the conclusion those facts were pointing toward. Margaret refilled my coffee without being asked, which is what good cafe owners do when they can see a person is sitting with something heavy. I thanked her and kept thinking. Thanksgiving dinner 2 days ago had been at my daughter's house, which used to be my daughter's and my son-in-law's house, and which now seemed to operate exclusively on his schedule and his preferences. He'd sat at the head of the table, which I'd let go years ago as a small accommodation. He'd led the toast. He'd spoken about the business, the way men speak about things they believe belong to them, using words like our growth strategy and where we're taking this, without acknowledging that where this had started was in my savings account, and my decision to spend 11 years building something from nothing. My daughter had barely spoken to me directly all evening. She'd been warm enough with the kids and deferential to her husband and distantly polite with me in the way you are with someone you've already mentally categorized as a previous chapter. Now I understood why. I paid for the coffee, left Margaret a good tip, and drove to the county courthouse when it opened at 8. The property records office was staffed by a woman named Sheila, who I'd known since her kids were in grade school. She was professional about it, which I appreciated. She pulled up the property records for the Main Street address while I waited. The deed still showed my name. Sole owner, no liens, no secondary parties, no changes since I'd paid off the commercial mortgage in 2019. I asked her to pull the business registration records next. Crawford's Hardware and Supply. Owner of record, myself. I'd last updated those documents 2 years ago, and had received no notification of any changes since. Whatever my son-in-law and my daughter thought they'd done, or were planning to do, they hadn't done it yet. The locks were changed, but the building was still mine. The locks were, legally speaking, my son-in-law's problem, not mine. I thanked Sheila and drove to find an attorney. Philip Gaines had an office above the insurance agency on Clement Street and had been practicing property and business law in Harlan Creek for over 20 years. His assistant was apologetic about the Friday morning timing, but when I explained the situation briefly, she put me through. I laid it out for him without emotional decoration. The property ownership, the business license, the locked doors, the years of gradual management displacement, the Thanksgiving dinner, and the Friday morning discovery. Philip listened without interrupting, which is the sign of an attorney who's actually thinking, rather than waiting for his turn to talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Crawford, do you have documentation of your ownership readily available?" I told him I had originals for everything in the fireproof box in my garage at home, which they hadn't changed the locks on yet, and digital copies in a cloud account my son-in-law didn't know existed because I'd set it up after a conversation 2 years ago that had made me uneasy enough to start keeping my own records. Philip said, "Come in Monday. Bring everything. But based on what you're telling me, they have no legal standing whatsoever. Changing the locks on a property they don't own isn't a business decision. It's trespassing." I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Philip's building for a while after that call. Not from shock. I'd had some version of this conversation with myself over the past year, working through the logical conclusions of what I was observing. But hearing it stated plainly by someone with legal expertise made it concrete, in a way my own internal monologue hadn't quite managed. They'd locked me out of my own building, a building I owned free and clear, a business I'd built from a concept and a savings account, and 11 years of 60-hour weeks. And they'd done it the morning after Thanksgiving, timing it to my trip to Knoxville, confident I'd come back confused and manageable and willing to negotiate terms they'd already decided on without me. They didn't know Philip Gaines's number. They didn't know about the cloud storage. They didn't know that the property records hadn't been touched, or that the business license still carried my name exclusively. They'd acted on the assumption that I was already defeated, that the gradual removal of my authority over the past 3 years had translated into actual legal powerlessness. That was the mistake I intended to use. I drove home, retrieved what I needed from the fireproof box, and spent Friday afternoon organizing documents at my kitchen table. Property deed, business license, commercial insurance policies, which, by the way, listed me as the sole named insured, meaning the coverage they were operating under was mine to cancel with a phone call, bank account records going back 11 years, tax returns filed under my social security number as the business owner, vendor contracts, several of which had personal guarantee clauses with my signature. My son-in-law had built a very comfortable management position inside a structure he believed he controlled. He'd forgotten, or never understood, that the structure itself belonged to someone else entirely. I called my brother Gerald that evening. He's 6 years younger than me, and has always had the kind of directness that comes from watching others make the same mistakes twice. I told him what had happened. He said, "What are you going to do?" I told him I was going to let the weekend pass quietly, meet with Philip on Monday, and then do what the law entitled me to do. I wasn't going to warn them. I wasn't going to negotiate from a position where they thought I had no options. I was going to let them believe, for a few more days, that they'd succeeded. Gerald said, "Good, don't call them." I didn't. Saturday passed. My daughter called twice. My son-in-law once, which surprised me. I let all three go to voicemail. My daughter's message was careful, almost scripted. Something about needing to discuss the store transition and hoping we could have a mature conversation as a family. My son-in-law's message was shorter and had an edge beneath the surface calm, asking me to call him back at my earliest convenience regarding some business matters. Some business matters. In my building. Under my insurance policy. Selling products purchased through my vendor relationships on an account at my bank. I watched college football on Saturday and made a pot of chili. It was the best chili I'd made in years. Amazing how appetite improves when you stop trying to make yourself small enough to fit inside a situation designed to diminish you. Philip's office Monday morning had the orderly, document-heavy atmosphere of a place where problems became paperwork and paperwork became solutions. He reviewed everything I'd brought with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned that legal cases are built on what's written down, not on what people believe or intended or assumed. He looked up from the property deed. They have no claim whatsoever, not to the property, not to the business. If they've altered the locks without your authorization, they've committed criminal trespass and potentially vandalism. He walked me through the options in plain language. I could demand immediate vacation of the premises and call the sheriff's department if they refused. I could pursue a cease and desist regarding unauthorized operation of my business. I could begin the process of formally restructuring the business in ways that remove them from any operational role entirely. And if I chose to sell the property or the business, that right was entirely mine, and the proceeds would belong entirely to me. What about the employees? I asked. The store had 4 full-time and 2 part-time staff members who had nothing to do with any of this. Philip said that protecting employees in a transition was possible and advisable, and that most buyers of an operating business preferred to retain experienced staff. I told him to prepare whatever documents were necessary to formally notify my daughter and my son-in-law that their access to the property was unauthorized and that they were to cease operating the business under my license immediately. I also asked him to begin identifying potential buyers, not because I necessarily wanted to sell, but because I wanted that option ready when I needed leverage. He also suggested, and I thought this was wise, that I contact the commercial insurance carrier and have my son-in-law removed from any operational authority on the policy. I made that call from the parking lot before I'd even backed out of my space. Tuesday, Philip sent formal notification letters to my daughter and my son-in-law at the store address. Certified mail, legal language, impossible to misunderstand. I know the exact moment they read them because my phone, which I had on silent, lit up for 6 straight hours. I had driven down to Gatlinburg for a few days. I had always wanted to stay at one of those cabin rentals up in the hills above the tourist strip. Something I'd never done because there was always a reason not to leave. Always something at the store that needed attention. Always someone who needed me to be available. I checked into a 2-bedroom cabin with a porch that looked out over a valley and spent the first afternoon sitting in a wooden rocking chair, watching clouds move between ridgelines. The phone showed 43 missed calls by dinner time Tuesday. My daughter's early voicemails were controlled, businesslike. The voice of a woman who'd prepared what she wanted to say and was delivering it carefully. "Dad, we need to talk about this. We've been trying to position the store for the future. This isn't what it looks like. Please call us back." My son-in-laws were less controlled. The first few maintained the professional tone he favored, but by late afternoon something was coming through beneath it. He'd spoken to an attorney of his own, that much was clear. He now understood what I'd already known since Saturday, that the legal ground he thought he was standing on didn't exist. By Wednesday morning, 71 missed calls. My daughter's messages had shifted. "Dad, I know we handled the transition wrong. I know we should have talked to you, but this is the business I grew up in. Please don't do something that hurts everyone." My son-in-law had stopped leaving messages entirely, which told me his attorney had advised him to stop creating a record of whatever he was saying. I went on a trail hike Wednesday morning and had a lunch of trout at a restaurant that had been operating since 1947 and clearly knew what it was doing. The mountains were doing what Tennessee mountains do in late fall, sitting in the middle distance being enormous and indifferent and beautiful. I took photographs that I knew I'd look at later when I needed to remember that the world was significantly larger than any one family's bad decisions. Philip texted me Wednesday afternoon with an update. A regional hardware cooperative that had been expanding into East Tennessee had made an inquiry about purchasing the Main Street property and the business assets, prompted by a connection Philip had through a previous client. They were serious buyers. Established operation, good reputation, the kind of purchaser who retained existing staff and maintained store identity. They could move quickly if I wanted to proceed. I texted back and told him to schedule a conversation. The call came Thursday morning on the cabin porch with coffee and the valley view. The cooperative's acquisition director was a straightforward woman named Diane, who clearly had done her research before calling. She knew the store's revenue history, its vendor relationships, its position in the local market. She had questions about the staff and the current inventory system and the age of the HVAC equipment. Not once did she mention my daughter or my son-in-law, because to her they were simply the current staff of a building she was considering purchasing from its owner, who was me. We agreed on a price that made me set down my coffee cup and look at the valley for a moment. 11 years of 60-hour weeks had produced something worth considerably more than I'd allowed myself to think about. Property value, business goodwill, inventory, equipment, the vendor relationships I'd built through a decade of being reliable and fair. Philip had given me a range to expect. The number Diane offered was at the top of it. I told her I was interested and that my attorney would be in touch to begin the process. My phone was running out of storage for voicemails by Thursday afternoon. 94 missed calls total when I finally scrolled through the list. The neighborhood of messages my daughter had left traced an emotional arc I recognized as a person, watching the permanence of consequences set in. The early messages had been strategic. The middle messages had been frustrated. The later ones were something closer to frightened. My son-in-law's final message, left Thursday morning before his attorney had apparently told him definitively to stop, was 11 seconds long. His voice was doing something I'd never heard it do in 8 years. It sounded genuinely uncertain. He said my name twice, and then said, "Please call back. This has gone further than we intended." Further than they intended. I thought about that phrase while I watched the sun go down behind the ridgeline Thursday evening. I thought about what they had intended, and how confident they must have felt on the morning after Thanksgiving when they changed those locks. How certain they must have been that the old man who'd smiled politely through dinner and driven off to Knoxville would come back manageable, would come back already positioned to accept whatever terms they offered, would be so relieved to have any role at all in something he'd built that he'd negotiate from gratitude instead of ownership. I thought about my wife, Linda, who died 15 years ago, and never got to see the store become what it became. She would have had opinions about all of this. Linda's opinions tended to arrive at the correct destination faster than most people, including me. She'd had reservations about my son-in-law from the engagement period, not dislike exactly, more like a careful watching that she'd described once as waiting to see which direction the man points himself when things get easy. I'd told her she was being unfair. I told her to give him time. She'd been right, which was not unusual for Linda. I drove back from Gatlinburg on Friday. The week in the mountains had done what distance always does, clarified what mattered and what didn't, separated the noise from the facts. The facts were that I owned a building and a business. A serious buyer wanted to purchase both. The current staff, who had done nothing wrong, would be retained by a reputable operation. The proceeds from the sale would fund the last chapter of my life without my having to accommodate anyone else's assumptions about what I owed them. I was pulling into my driveway when I saw my daughter's car parked at the curb. She was sitting in it. She got out when she saw my truck, and I could see from 30 feet away that the week had cost her something. She looked like a woman who'd been sleeping badly and thinking constantly, which are related conditions. My son-in-law was not with her. That was her decision, or his attorney's advice, or both. She said, "Dad, can we talk?" I said, "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table where I'd organized the documents the previous Friday, the same table where I'd eaten chili on Saturday night, and felt, for the first time in years, like a man who still had options. I made coffee without asking if she wanted any because she'd drunk coffee at this table since she was old enough to hold a cup. She was quiet for a moment, which was not typical for her. My daughter had always known how to fill silence with words, a useful skill in business, and in the family arguments we'd had over the years when she was a teenager, and the world was something she was certain she understood completely. She said, "We thought you were going to step back anyway. We thought we were getting ahead of something that was already happening." I let that sit without responding. She said, "That doesn't make it right." I know that. I told her she was correct. It didn't make it right. She asked about the sale. She'd spoken to Philip's office and understood the process was moving. She asked if there was anything she could do to stop it. I told her, gently because she was still my daughter, and that was still a fact about my life that mattered. that the time to stop it would have been before the locks were changed. That a conversation before Thanksgiving would have been the place to say whatever she needed to say about the future of the business. That I'd have listened, because I'd always listened to her, even when she was wrong, because that's what I'd understood the word father to mean. She said, "He pushed for this faster than I was comfortable with." I should have said that. I told her I believed her, and that it didn't change the outcome, and that one of the things I hoped she'd carry forward was the knowledge that the moment to stop something like this is before it starts, not after the papers have arrived and the attorneys are involved. She cried briefly, in the contained way of someone who's been holding it for days and doesn't want to fully let it go in front of an audience. I let her. I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't, and she knew it wasn't, and telling her otherwise would have been a small cruelty disguised as kindness. When she asked where I was going to live, I told her I had plans, and that they were mine to make. When she asked if we were still family, I told her we were, and that I expected that answer from her to grow into something she demonstrated rather than just claimed. She left. I stood at the window and watched her car pull away from the curb and move down the street the way it had moved down this street hundreds of times in her life, and I noticed how different something familiar can look when you're seeing it without illusions. The closing happened 3 weeks later in Philip's conference room. The cooperative's acquisition team was professional and efficient. The sales agreement specified that all current full-time staff would be offered continued employment at equivalent wages, which I'd made a condition of the deal. The signing took about an hour. Philip had organized the documents in the logical order of a man who'd done this enough times to know where the complexity lived and how to move through it cleanly. When it was done, the building on Main Street belonged to someone who had purchased it honestly and would maintain it with the respect that ownership creates when ownership is earned rather than assumed. I signed the final documents and felt something I hadn't expected, which was not satisfaction exactly, more like accuracy, the feeling of something being described correctly after years of the description being wrong. The check was what it was, more than enough for the kind of life I intended to build in the next chapter, wherever I chose to build it. A friend of Gerald's had a place on Watts Bar Lake he'd been renting out. 2 bedrooms, a dock, and enough quiet to hear yourself think. I'd called him the week before from Gatlinburg, and we'd had a good conversation about the terms. I loaded my truck one more time, the things that mattered and not the things that didn't, and I drove east toward the lake. Tennessee is full of water if you know where to look for it. Rivers and reservoirs tucked into the hills with an indifference to human drama that I'd come to find genuinely comforting. The water doesn't know about your family. The herons fishing in the shallows don't have opinions about your business decisions. The mornings on a lake dock are exactly as long as mornings are supposed to be. My daughter called the week I moved in. We talked for a while, not about the business or the legal process or any of the events of November, but about smaller things, the kind of things you talk about when you're trying to find the ground beneath a relationship that's been disturbed and see if there's anything solid worth building on. It was an honest conversation, which is a better description than good, but also more accurate. My son-in-law didn't call. His attorney had presumably advised him that there was nothing useful to say, and for once in the time I'd known him, he'd taken advice that served him well. The hardware cooperative sent me a note 3 months after the closing, a brief professional letter from Diane, informing me that the store had its best January in 5 years and that the staff had been retained in full. She thanked me for building something worth buying. I read the letter on the dock with coffee, watching a great blue heron stand in the shallows about 40 feet out, with the absolute patience of a creature that understands how waiting works. It stood there long enough that I stopped watching and poured a second cup, and when I looked back, it was already gone, moving somewhere else with whatever it had come for. 67 years had taught me that what you build belongs to you until you decide otherwise, and that the decision of otherwise is yours to make on your own terms, in your own time, for your own reasons. They'd wanted me to disappear on their schedule. I disappeared on mine. That's a different thing entirely.